If you'd like to sew a new jacket yet are undecided which color to choose, select 2. Our guest today will show you that 2 color waves are better than 1 since her technique produces a reversible jacket. Welcome back, Betty Cotton. Betty is the creator of Quilt First, Assemble Second technique. Betty, you've been on Sewing with Nancy a couple seasons ago, and we made standard quilt tops or table decor, but now you have a new repertoire to add to your quilting option.
My method is great for geometric shapes of quilting as well as your simple pattern pieces for wearables. Here's one side of a reversible jacket. Notice the classic styling. Just by turning it other side out, you'll have another wardrobe option.
Cotton Theory Quilting, reversible jackets. That's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, a complete line of sewing, quilting, and embroidery machines and sergers. Baby Lock, for the love of sewing. Madeira, specializing in embroidery, quilting, and special effect threads, because creativity is never black and white. Koala Sewing Cabinets, hand-built in the USA by American craftsmen, customized for you. Clover, makers of sewing, knitting, quilting, and embroidery products for over 25 years. Experience the Clover difference. Amazing designs and Class A needles.
We'd like to start the second program of our 2-part series as a quick review of Betty's technique of quilting first and sewing the pieces together second. This was a jacket that we worked with during the first program, reversible. And Betty, you have a great hint about fabrics.
Great contrast colors.
Excellent contrast colors, and the body of the jackets are quilted, then cut out, and then the pieces are connected together with strips and a specialty technique which we'll show you and review again called a one-way street, or 2 one-way streets put together gets a merging lane of a connecting strip, so it's completely reversible. The first step is to cut sections of fabric, the one right side and the other right side, and meet them wrong sides together. Now if you'd like a quilted jacket with a batting in it, like the one I'm wearing, Betty, you'd recommend lightweight batting.
Lightweight enough so you don't have the stiffness in a wearable.
This is a poly cotton batting, and the sleeve section has been quilted together with an interesting stitch called a wobble stitch.
The reason I chose a wobble versus a straight stitch, no matter how hard you try to stay perfectly straight, you're going to wobble a little bit. Makes you perfect.
So as you saw earlier, it was just a little bit of a zigzag with a grid about 1 inch apart so that you could easily grid this, cut it out, and then to sew the pieces together, we're going to use connector strips. And the connector strips are bias strips that are 2 3/4 inches wide. And here they are, long lengths. And in the book that accompanies the program, we can get through details, but this is basically the 2 3/4 inch strips that have another wobble stitch down the center. The first step is to put together the sleeves. And Betty, you have a raglan style pattern that you're working with and that we're both wearing. The sleeve, the front and back are put together. And this is just a great technique.
Nancy, before I get to this, can I add that the jacket I'm wearing has no batting?
You certainly may.
You actually have that choice.
Yes, and no batting can, so you just have 2 layers of fabric and I have 3. I'm a little warmer than you are.
Exactly. I have several pieces here just showing you I'm sewing a connector on, and the importance of the bias is because we're going to take on some curves.
And the important thing is that this has been put on with a 1 inch seam
allowance, which is a little bit normal, a little bit bigger than what you would normally sew with.
But this pattern has adaptation so that it can stand that 1 inch.
Yes. We're going to sew on the connector, then press them toward the outside edge, and I'm going to flip it over just to show you. My connector is actually out here. I've started trimming this because I'm going to finish it with about a 1/4 inch seam is all I'm going to leave here.
And we're just eyeballing that off.
And here I've got the same piece where I've just started a couple pins, and I'm actually going to just double fold this back to the original seam, and I will get a pin in here. And one more.
Okay.
And then, we actually even hold it up, you can just see the dimension of what that finish is like. That's the one-way street.
And then to hold this down, here's a close-up of stitching with an open-air decorative stitch, guiding down, stitching down in the ditch.
Stitching the ditch with your decorative stitch.
And here on the opposite side of the sample is the stitching that has been completed, and it's dimensional. Then you attach a 1-inch seam to the other pattern piece.
As you see here, I've already sewn it, repeated the 1-inch seam, trimmed, folded, pinned, and it too is ready for stitching.
So this double fold, again, would be stitching down the edge. And once that has been stitched, I'd just like to show you what this looks like on the completed sleeve. Very neat. Very neat.
Gives you
And
the flexibility that you need to move.
and those bias strips will form around the curves. And then here you can see what it looks like on the other side of the jacket. Now, during the first program of this series, we assembled the jacket using this basic technique to get the inner portions of the jacket hooked together. The sleeves, you would have a complete jacket. We just have a half jacket here, the front and the back. Now what we'd like to share with you is the binding techniques, the outer finishing techniques for the outer edge and the hems. We're now going to go through the finishing techniques on the outer edges of the jacket. And Betty, your use of connector strips is so unique. Because we had this connector strip, remember the connector strips were 2 3/4 inches wide and 2 sewn together, cut on the bias, and that's what attached the jacket pieces. But those same 2 fabrics, could be in a different color, also do this binding.
Nancy, that gives you the illusion that it's 2 connector strips and it's literally nothing more than that same connector.
And I was amazed how that was put together, so we will give you the details. Decide what 2 fabrics you'd like to see on the outer edge, and this is a higher contrast. We have the darker green and the darker red, and then they're stitched down the center with that wobble stitch, that narrow zigzag elongated stitch. Along one edge, fold half of the width, fold it in thirds, and then in a third again, so that it meets the center wobble stitch. Let me do that again. Fold it once, a third, and a third until it meets that edge, and pin. Now let me show you what that correlates to. That red edge is what you see in this area, and Betty now is going to stitch with that decorative stitch, that folded fabric, to the binding itself. The setup of your machine is
I have it set for a joining stitch, which is literally an elastic stitch, and I've altered my width to about 6.0 and my length to 1.6. I'm going to be sewing on that quilting line where the edge of the fold is. So I'm literally just going to be catching half of that fold. It's also going to match the rest of the connectors in the jacket.
That's the stitch you've used throughout.
Throughout the entire piece. And this is only half of that curve appeal binding.
And you use road techniques or terminology to describe quilting, and you gave a great analogy why you've done that. You have the one-way street, the merging lanes, now the curb appeal.
Well, technically, when you do quilts, they all have intersections. It's all very fitting. There is the finished half of what we're going to accomplish. Now, we need to finish the other part, but to do that, I'm going to sew this onto my little mock jacket front. Nancy, this is the only time I don't have a 1-inch seam because it's not a seam allowance here. It's a binding. So I'm going to pin this. I marked 3/4 of an inch down from my raw edge, and that's actually the placement line of my jacket edge,
Okay.
the front neck. So I'm just going to get a pin in here temporarily to hold it, and I'm going to go back to my straight stitch.
And you've already done that on another sample.
So here you can see where I've stitched it down. My 1-inch seam. Here's the little red piece that you're seeing. I need to double fold back to the original seam. And I'm going to pin it in place. As you can see here, I've started, so I'm going to just finish off my seam here. And I'm going to take that same joining stitch and stitch this in place.
Because the connector strips have been cut on the bias, you can mold and curve around the shape of the hemline or the outer edge.
Very nicely, and it keeps the same width throughout. I think that's good enough to sew.
Yes, it is. And you're going to use that same joining stitch.
Remove my first pin.
As Betty continues to stitch this, I again like to just show you along the edge the second row of stitching. That second row of stitching is on the inner part of the jacket as well as on the green. So it's very important to see that those two joining stitches, the first row and the second row, and you have curve appeal binding. There's one more step to finish this jacket, and that is to hem the lower edge, the hem edge of the jacket. Usually the hemming is last. Well, that certainly is what happens in this case. We just finished with the outer binding, and now you can look at the finished binding along the lower portion. It's just one strip of fabric. This is the difference for this technique, and it's cut. A strip is cut 2.5 inches wide. You'll be measuring the finished length along the hemline. The front will be finished, the side seams will be finished, so that length, and to that length you're going to add 3 inches. Seems like a mighty large seam allowance, Betty, but we're going to do something quite different.
It is, so you don't have the seam bulk on the sides. We're going to actually have a mitered seam on those dead end bindings.
And to make the mitered seam, we're going to cut a trapezoid. And if it's been a while since you've cut a trapezoid, we've marked a 45-degree line at each end. 45 and trim, 45 and trim, and you can see I have more fabric in the middle, and then we're going to sew these seams. Now to sew the seam, I'm just going to fold the edges to their meeting, and there'll be let me just hold this up so I can see it. I'm going to fold these so that the edges meet, and then the extension will be like a rabbit ear. It's only 1/4 of an inch, and you stitch along the 1/4 of an inch seam. This seam has been stitched and trimmed and pressed, except it hasn't been turned. And when it turns, you can see that the seam is angled out of the way of the bulk of the seam, and you'd sew both ends. And now this piece is stitched to the lower hem, and Betty, you've done the first step.
I have it sewn on with a regular pressure foot width. The next thing I'm going to do is actually flip it to the front side, and I'm going to actually pin it again back at my original seam line. And Nancy, I'm going to take my favorite joining stitch and stitch in the seam, so there's literally no handwork.
This is a very typical way of binding an edge. This is not an extra creative way, but it certainly is efficient because you have that trapezoid seam and there isn't any bulk.
These slits that we created when we connected the jacket, this is a great way because my binding stops and starts. Believe it or not, I have 6 of these.
Along the lower edge of the jacket.
My machine is still set up for my joining stitch, and I'm actually ready to stitch it in place.
And just stitch that binding all the way along the edge. That is a tricky seam to get really close to stitch down the edge, and as Betty keeps on stitching, I will just show you the finished edge of this jacket. Just the fold, it's been folded to around the edges, and you can see that that joining stitch again is very visible. So that's such a lot of continuity in this jacket for the joining stitches and the binding, very creative. So now you know the basics of reversible jackets. Expand your horizons by adding scenic view quilting to your reversible jacket. Notice that you can have one look on one side and then change to the other side to again have a very creative look. Betty and I will show you how to work with machine embroidery and a wobble stitch. This idea of expanding a basic quilted jacket to add creativity is really unique, Betty. And why did you choose this particular arrangement?
I wanted to add embroidery to my jacket, so instead of the bodice or the back, I decided that it could go on the bottom portion of the sleeve. So I chose a design that was light and airy. Remember, I'm going through quilt layers.
Yes.
So I didn't want anything too dense, but you can see the reversibility very nicely by quilting it in the hoop.
And sometimes if you wear too much embroidery on your body, it's just too heavy looking.
It can
and
be
this
overwhelming.
On the sleeve is a very nice focal point. Now the pattern that you're working with has a line marked so that you can make some changes.
I'm actually going to cut the bottom portion of my sleeve off, and here's a template. So literally, what I have to do is quilt some pieces and put the pieces of the puzzle together, at least bigger than my template size.
Now if we look at this puzzle, we kind of pull it apart. You can see the top portion is the front sleeve and the back sleeve.
Which had to be put together first.
And then there's a connector. And then we're going to start with the embroidery. Now the embroidery, you chose something not real dense.
Not dense, it's a feather. However, there's one thing with that feather. It's directional.
Oh, yes.
So it is important that if you are going to have sleeves, to mirror image them.
So here's a close-up of the embroidery unit, and you'll see the feather stitch on the LCD screen. It's a very common stitch. The fabric is layered. There's the backing in between the green and the purple fabric, and then just stitching the design through all layers. It's a very easy way of utilizing, if you have an embroidery machine, to add quilting to this project. Now, as Betty mentioned, you need to make 2 of these, one for each arm.
Each sleeve.
And notice the mirror image of the design. So you just push the mirror image button and presto, you can have the right directional pointing of the this is a feather, right?
Design.
Yes, okay, this is a feather. So that's a very simple way of doing it. Now, you notice on Betty's design, the stitching is just a little heavier than on the one we had. You may want to consider using a heavy thread. We're using a 12-weight thread to create this design, and then just rayon thread in this area. So if your machine can adapt, please use the heavier thread for an additional emphasis.
So you're literally looking at the bobbin, the top thread.
This is a little different grid.
It's a little bit heavier than my normal wobble stitch, and actually it's a lot closer together, but it's tighter to give you the illusion of the old elbow patch on a sleeve, Nancy.
Maybe not all our viewers were wearing jackets in the 70s, but we did. Elbow patches were very predominant. This is the width of our current stitching, but here Betty just put it a presser foot width away, and making it a grid instead of just linear. So a lot of stitching, but it's a nice look. So you cut the sections accordingly, just made a puzzle.
Just made a puzzle.
So-
I have sizes provided in the pattern itself, so really these are very generous. And once they're connected together, and that's literally what our job is to do next, is to make it at least bigger than my template, which you can clearly see that this is. And then I'm ready to attach it to the upper portion of the sleeve.
And you'd sew the connector strips to the embroidery or the quilting strips, and then cut out the bottom template.
Yes.
And here is another half jacket that has been put together, a nice accent on both sides of this quilted piece. Well, we've taken quite a road here, quite a road through this 2-part series of working with just the basics and now adding the creativity. Betty, you have a great mind and great processes for thinking this through.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the reversibility of the jackets. I get 2 for 1.
Yes, you certainly do. It's a great bargain, and it's very enjoyable to create as well as to wear. During our last program, Rachel O'Neill was our guest from Little Dresses from Africa. Her story is so inspiring that I've invited her back to continue to tell the tale of creating dresses for the little ones who are very oppressed, who could really deserve a warm hug and a new dress. Welcome back, Rachel.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us and for your story of sharing 21,000 and counting dresses to little girls in Africa.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, last time we showed the pillowcase samples of making a pillowcase or using a pillowcase and cutting it across the fold, cutting little U-shaped sections, adding a casing at the top,
Right.
and bias tape makes a world of difference to a little girl.
Sure does. Very simple, but makes a huge difference.
On the Sewing with Nancy website, you'll find the link to Little Dresses from Africa, and some of your seamstresses add little touches of lace or trim. You're holding one that a lady has even added a toy.
Yes, in fact, this particular woman, who's a friend locally, makes a little doll in the pocket of each one and sends that. And you can just feel the love as these go with the children in the dresses.
Now, Rachel explained to us last time that she took a trip for her 50th birthday, fell in love with the country of Africa, the continent of Africa,
Right.
the countries, and the children.
Yes.
Started this mission of helping kids. But what I wanted to invite you back to explain is that it has meaning on both sides of the water.
Right. At first it seemed that it was just my mission and it was something that I wanted to do. But as we started sewing, more and more people got involved. And we found that without or very little advertising at all, the word of mouth, just one person would tell another one. And pretty soon, it's a rare day that I don't have a box on the porch from another state even. And we've received from over 36 states and several boxes from each state. So everyone is getting involved.
So you also explained that the sewers, which our audience is comprised with,
Yes.
some people are confined to homes.
Yes.
So how it's helped.
We hear wonderful stories. In fact, it's been a real joy to be on the front seat of hearing some of these stories. People that are agoraphobic, have not left their home in years, will sew and have a way to help others. People that are sick and they're homebound are able to help. And then there are the people that are social, so they start a group and they get together with others and they sew. Children sewing with their grandparents, just on and on like that. Every group, Girl Scouts, community
That's right.
groups, church groups, it really just covers a lot. And we see that it really changes lives here and across the ocean.
The important part, I think, is that these are simple projects.
Very simple.
And if you're teaching someone to sew, perhaps a
It's
young
perfect.
girl, it's just a great way, and it gets children thinking other than inward.
That's exactly the point, yes. And it seems that when you do start thinking about helping others, all of a sudden our problems don't seem so severe.
Because they're not.
That's right, they aren't.
That's right.
They
And when
aren't.
we see some of the pictures of the children in Africa
Yes.
wearing your dresses,
They're gorgeous.
they're gorgeous. Their eyes tell a lot
Yes,
of stories,
yes.
and it's made a difference to them as well as to people
Right.
who are making them.
Yes.
So your trips you've been there 4 times.
Correct.
And 3 times you've made deliveries.
Right. And of course I can't take all the dresses that
Yes,
come.
and this is an interesting part of your story.
Right. So I do send them with mission groups that are going. A lot of people contact me through the website, and I send them with groups that are already going, and they distribute them through the kids' camps and schools and communities, orphanages. And then I also mail them. And we have fundraisers to raise money and send them, probably 2 boxes a week, maybe 3 boxes a week. And then I also take them personally myself with a team. There were 10 of us this year that went, 12 last year. So it just depends. And we take as many as we can.
And they don't weigh a lot. And
No.
for those of us who have maybe just a few boxes of fabric stored
Right.
under our bed.
Right. I find that a lot of people
Yes.
do.
You could certainly wouldn't have to use a pillowcase, even
not
though they're called
necessarily.
pillowcase dresses, but
Yes.
using something the size of a pillowcase
Exactly.
to make this. And they're just
Thank you. They're in all
wonderful
sizes.
thing. Well, Rachel, this has been an inspiring story.
Thank you.
And we encourage all of you to make something for someone this year that you don't know and give it away, because the gift is in the giving. And you can go to the sewingwithnancy.com website, and from that point, click under Nancy's Corner and find under the 2300 series the link to Rachel's Little Dresses for Africa. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this two-part series, not only with Nancy's Corner, but during our sewing segment featuring Betty Cotton and the Cotton Theory quilting, the reversible jackets. Thanks to Betty for being my guest, as well as to Rachel for being my guest, and also thank you for joining us on Sewing with Nancy. Bye for now.
Betty Cotton has written a fully illustrated book entitled Cotton Theory Quilting Reversible Jackets, which serves as the reference for this two-part series. It's $15.95 plus shipping and handling. To order the book, which includes the pattern, call 800-336-8373 or visit our website at sewingwithnancy.com/2319. Order item number QY42, Cotton Theory Quilting Reversible Jackets. Credit card orders only. To pay by check or money order, call the number on the screen for details. For more Cotton Theory quilting techniques, go to sewingwithnancy.com. Sewing with Nancy, TV's longest-airing sewing and quilting program with Nancy Zieman, is made possible by Baby Lock, Madeira Threads, Koala Cabinets, Clover, Amazing Designs, and Classe Needles. Closed captioning funding provided by Rowenta. Sewing with Nancy is a co-production of Nancy Zieman Productions and Wisconsin Public Television.